Hello everyone, and welcome to my Dawntrail Black Mage guide. If you're looking to get better at Black Mage, this video is for you. My name is Eksu Plosion. I'm a Black Mage main who primarily does endgame content like Savage Raiding, World Progression, and Speedrunning. This video is aimed to cover many topics, including the basics, as well as optimization you can employ in your gameplay to take yourself to the next level. This video does have a lot to cover, so I'll be including timestamps in the description for all of the major topics. If any patches happen after I've released this guide that significantly alters the Black Mage playstyle, I'll be sure to post an updated video afterwards. While this guide will primarily cover Black Mage at level 100, there are also some takeaways for lower level players. Black Mage is all about cycling between your mana spending Astral Fire phase and mana restoration Umbral Ice phase. The challenge comes with maintaining your casting uptime during fight mechanics. Unlike the other casters, Black Mages don't bring any raid buffs to the table, similar to Samurai, Viper, and Machinist. However, they make up for it with high and consistent damage output when played well. You need to carefully plan positioning and use your tools like Swiftcast and Triplecast to stay mobile while executing any mechanics a fight will throw at you. Mastering this balance is what makes Black Mage so rewarding to play, and challenging too. Personally, I find it very satisfying executing the many mechanics of Savage Raids, Alliance Raids, Extreme Trials, and Ultimate Raids while not dropping any casts. Now you might be wondering, what gear should you get as a Black Mage? Black Mages have two main options when it comes to gearing. As all of your damage comes in the form of spells on the global cooldown, Black Mage benefits a lot more from spell speed versus other casters like Pictomancer, Red Mage, and Summoner. However, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to go all in on spell speed. Let me explain. The first gearing option you have when it comes to Black Mage is a critical hit oriented set. This set will have a high crit stat, over 3000, and usually have a low amount of spell speed, anywhere from 900 to 1100 spell speed usually. These normally put you at around 2.44 to 2.42 GCD. The benefit of going this route is that if you do like to play the other casters, going with a low spell speed set will be more compatible and make flexing to the other ones easier. The second gearing option is a spell speed oriented set. This one will have spell speeds usually higher than 2500. Right now, at the time of making this video, the highest spell speed stat you can have is 3148, which puts your global cooldown at 2.18 seconds. These sets will also naturally have a low crit stat. This is because gear with spell speed on it almost never has critical hit, mostly because this would hurt the other casters more. In these sets, you will mostly meld more spell speed, determination, and direct hit. You would not want to meld critical hit on a spell speed oriented build because you would not have enough crit stat to make it worthwhile. Critical hit as a stat scales non-linearly, different than direct hit or determination. That means the more crit you have, the more you will benefit. Basically, you have to go all in on crit, or don't meld it at all. At the end of the day, the DPS difference that we model between these two types of builds is very small, somewhere around 10 DPS. You should play the one that you enjoy playing the most, and consider what else you might be playing. That being said, the critical hit build is definitely far more popular among Omnicasters, given that you can then use the same gear for playing Pictomancer, Red Mage, and Summoner. Crit builds will also be better when playing in compositions with Scholars or Dragoons, as you will make much more usage of their critical hit raid buffs, Chain Stratagem, and Battle Litany. There are other considerations for spell speed versus crit as well, which we will talk about later in the video. Now that we've covered the gearing options for Black Mage, let's talk about actually playing it in an encounter. First, we'll go over the opener for Black Mage. Your opener is what you'll do at the start of a raid or trial and typically involves a countdown pre-pull. It is important to remember that your opener is not the same as your rotation. We'll be covering the rotation a bit further in the video. Openers are mainly used to synchronize raid buffs between team members for increased damage output, as well as to use your long cooldown abilities like Amplifier and Leylines to start the recast timer, and to set you up rotationally for the fight. While openers can definitely be different depending on the fight, the recommended general purpose opener for Dawntrail is known as the Fire 3 opener pictured on screen. You'll begin by casting Fire 3 approximately 4 seconds in the countdown, so that the damage will apply at 0 seconds. Immediately use High Thunder to get your dot on the boss. From here, we can weave Swiftcast and Amplifier to get their recasts rolling. Your next Fire 4 with Swiftcast will now be instant, and you can weave your Intelligence Potion from it. Your second Fire 4 is hardcasted. You might be asking why not use Triplecast instead of Swiftcast so that the second one is also instant. This is mainly because by the time this hardcasted Fire 4 finishes, it will be around 6.5 to 7 seconds into the fight, which will generally be slightly after raid buffs come out, meaning your Fire 4 will be in raid buffs. If you use Triplecast instead of Swiftcast, this Fire 4 would have come out at around 4 seconds, completely missing raid buffs. At this point, you can use Xenoglossy to weave Triplecast and Leylines. Use 2 Triplecast charges on 2 Fire 4s, and then use Despair to weave Manafont. Your last Triplecast charge is used on the Fire 4 after Manafont, where you can now use your second Triplecast charge on Fire 4, Flare Star, and another Fire 4. High Thunder is reapplied nearing the end of the raid buff window to refresh it in buffs. You'll finally finish your Astral Fire phase by using Paradox and 3 Fire 4s and Despair. While you could slot in a Xenoglossy here as around 30 seconds would have passed, I'd recommend saving it for movement later given that you've just used both of your Triplecast charges. For some fights, using Leylines earlier is preferred, like the beginning of Future's Rewritten Ultimate, where the boss leaves the arena 34 seconds in. In these instances, you can pre-pull Leylines. That is, use Leylines about 5 seconds before the countdown starts and Fire 3 a little after 4 seconds pre-pull. Alternatively, if you didn't want to pre-pull but you still wanted to get Leylines out earlier, you could slot it into a double weave with your potion. There's lots of opportunities here. However, the same logic still applies for delaying Triplecast and wanting to hardcast your first Fire 4 in buffs. You might want to hardcast a second Fire 4 if you used Leylines earlier, in order to make sure you don't dodge too many party buffs. You'll notice that this opener leaves you with 4 out of 6 Astral Souls at the end of your Fire phase, and you might be wondering if you should cast Flare instead of Despair to get another Flare Star, and the answer is no, because Flare is very weak on one target compared to Despair, and having to cast a weak spell in order to use a slightly stronger one just isn't worth it. After Despair, you'll transition to Umbral Ice using Blizzard 3, and then we'll get into the standard single target rotation. If you played Black Mage and Endwalker, the single target rotation is essentially the same as before, known as the standard rotation or simply standard. You'll enter Umbral Ice with Blizzard 3 and then cast Blizzard 4. This will give you 10,000 MP since Blizzard 4 was cast in Umbral Ice 3. It will also give you Umbral Hearts, which are needed to perform the rotation. You can then use your Umbral Ice Paradox. Also, if your High Thunder dot is about to fall off, you can refresh it during Umbral Ice as well. Transition to Astral Fire with Fire 3, at which point you generally want to use 4 Fire 4s, Paradox, 2 Fire 4s, Despair, and Flare Star. First of all, some things to note about this rotation. Number 1, High Thunder may need to be refreshed in Umbral Ice or Astral Fire. The rotation is longer than 30 seconds, and your dot only lasts 30 seconds, so you will be casting it at different points in the rotation every time. Number 2, since Paradox in Astral Fire is now an instant cast, you will want to give yourself the most possible room with Enochian to prevent dropping gauge. This is why it is recommended to cast 4 Fire 4s in the first half of your Astral Fire phase. This makes the latter half of your Astral Fire phase only have to deal with 2 Fire 4s, a Despair, and a Flare Star. However, you can still do 3 Fire 4s, Paradox, 3 Fire 4s, Despair, and Flare Star if you prefer. Number 3, Despair and Flare Star can swap orders. It really depends on the situation. Sometimes you will want to use the Astral Fire refreshing properties of Despair and then use Flare Star. Other times you may want to use Flare Star first and then the Despair for movement or weaving. For example, if you do decide to use 3 Fire 4s in the front half of Astral Fire, you will generally want to Despair before Flare Star in the latter half for an Enochian refresh, especially on slower spell speed sets. Now, to answer some frequently asked questions about this rotation. Number 1, what would it look like if you wanted to refresh High Thunder during your Astral Fire phase? Let's say that your High Thunder dot fell off after your first Fire 4 in Astral Fire. You could do something like this, and refresh your High Thunder after the first Fire 4. Really, any of these Fire 4s in the first half could be replaced with the High Thunder and the same logic would apply. However, what about refreshing in the latter half? If you only do 3 Fire 4s in the first half, your second half would look like this. While this wasn't possible before patch 7.1 at all spell speeds because Despair used to be hardcast, now that Despair is instant cast at level 100, you will not drop Enochian even at lower spell speeds. You'll just need to make sure you use Despair before Flare Star in this scenario so you don't drop Enochian. As a general rule of thumb, if you see that your dot has around 10 to 15 seconds left on it when entering Umbral Ice, you will know that you're going to refresh in the first half of Astral Fire. Similarly, if you see that your dot has around 15 to 20 seconds left when entering Astral Fire, you will be doing a refresh in the latter half of Astral Fire, so you could prepare and give yourself some leeway by using 4 Fire 4s in the first half. How about using Xenoglossy during the rotation? Generally speaking, Xenoglossy should be used first and foremost for movement. That is, you'll need to move from point A to point B, but you still want to be doing something, ideally casting a spell that does damage, and not just running around without doing anything. Usually this will coincide with wanting to weave an off-global cooldown ability like Triplecast or Swiftcast so that you can use them on Fire 4s. Xenoglossy can also be held for 2-minute raid buff windows, but be careful that you don't spend too many of your resources that you're deprived of movement options completely. How about Swiftcast or Triplecast? When should you insert these into the rotation? Black Mage is an interesting job when considering Swift and Triplecast because Black Mage's longest casting spells, Fire 4, Flare Star, and Flare, have a cast time that is longer than the recast time. When you make these spells instant via Swift or Triplecast, you are actually going to be using the recast time, not the cast time. So any Fire 4 that you make instant accelerates your rotation and saves you time. That means that instant casting of Fire 4, or a Flare Star, or Flare in AoE, is a DPS gain. Black Mages at the highest level want to optimize their usages of Triplecast and Swiftcast such that you don't lose a usage, but also that you're using them on high value spells like Fire 4 and Flare Star. Typically, the most optimal usage of Triplecast will be on 2 Fire 4s and Flare Star. As we've already covered, Despair being already instant cast at level 100 means that it doesn't consume a charge of Triplecast, so you could do something like Xenoglossy, Weave Triplecast, Fire 4, Despair, and then Flare Star. And you'll commonly see this as the most applied usage of Triplecast for Black Mages. That being said, there's nothing wrong with instant casting 3 Fire 4s too. The third usage of Triplecast that you'll see will use Triplecast on Fire 4, Flare Star, and Blizzard 3, as pictured here. However, in this case, you will be transposing before casting Blizzard 3. Remember how casting Blizzard 3 in Astral Fire has a damage penalty. Well, if you transpose to Umbral Ice before casting Blizzard 3, you will remove that damage penalty. This changes your Blizzard 3 from a 196 potency cast to a 280 potency cast, an 84 potency gain. This is only really applicable when instant casting Blizzard 3, since if you tried to transpose and hardcast it, you'll have a 3.5 second cast time. Technically, this usage of Triplecast results in the most raw damage gain, but since you aren't gaining any time from instant casting Blizzard 3 compared to the normal fast casts, you'll need to consider whether saving that 0.4 seconds or so from instant casting a Fire 4 would have netted you higher than 84 potency in the form of getting another cast off before the fight ends. It's not an easy question to answer without knowing the exact kill time of the boss or phase length, so generally I wouldn't worry too much about it unless you want to spreadsheet your rotation out accurately. How about Manafont? Where does Manafont go in this rotation now that it has been updated for Dawntrail? In Dawntrail, Manafont is a 100 second cooldown ability that puts you in Astral Fire 3 and grants 3 Umbral Hearts, 10,000 MP, and Paradox. It's essentially a full refresh that lets you do another full Astral Fire phase. Generally, you'll want to use Manafont close to on cooldown as possible to prevent losing a usage. Manafont isn't really a burst cooldown that you'll purposely delay to align with buffs. Maximizing usages of it in a fight is the priority. However, if you realize that you won't lose a usage, it's not the biggest deal in the world to delay a usage. Let's take the Chaotic Alliance raid as an example. with the enrage of the fight being approximately 11 minutes and 20 seconds in, and your first Manafont happening at roughly 14 seconds, if you used Manafont perfectly on cooldown, your last Manafont in that fight would happen at 10 minutes and 14 seconds, and you wouldn't get the next one since that would be at 11 minutes and 54 seconds after the enrage. This knowledge basically means that you can safely delay a usage if your group is killing near the enrage, or faster than 10 minutes and 14 seconds. Another common question is, when do you use Leylines, especially now that it has 2 charges since patch 7.1? First, it's important to recognize that Leylines being a charged action simply means that you will get an extra Leylines usage in an encounter. More importantly, it means that you are allowed to drift your Leylines a bit without losing a usage. For example, in a fight like P12S Part 2, using Leylines in the 4-minute Pangenesis tower buff window was very difficult, since the randomness of the mechanic would make you have to lose a lot of its duration. Nowadays, you would delay your Leylines until the mechanic is over, such that you can get full usage of its duration. That being said, generally you will want to use Leylines during your group's 2-minute raid buff window. This is so that you can maximize the number of casts that you can get into raid buffs and do the most damage possible. Your 1 extra Leylines that you start a fight with can be used at any point between the 0 and 2-minute mark. In some encounters you might want to use it right away after your opener Leylines expires. In others, perhaps you'll use it a minute in after a specific mechanic. It's very flexible and fight dependent, so I'd always consider what mechanics the fight you're doing is requiring you to do and adapt accordingly. Another question you might have is, what do you do with the Fire 3 procs that you get from casting Paradox and Astral Fire? As a priority, they should be used in an emergency situation to maintain Enochian. If, for example, you used your Astral Fire Paradox early, like casting 2 Fire 4s and then Paradox, you will most likely need to use the Fire 3 proc during Astral Fire in order to not drop Enochian. You might also want to use them as an instant cast to weave an OGCD, like Manafont, Amplifier, Mana Ward, or Leylines. However, there is a better usage for them. All you have to do is use Transpose before entering Astral Fire and use your Fire 3 proc. It would look something like this. We call this sequence of spells the AF1 F3P Standard Line. This uses your Fire 3 proc in an efficient way, getting rid of the weak 196 potency Fire 3 cast from Umbralize 3. Instead of having the 0.7x damage penalty, you will now have a 1.4x damage bonus. Overall, this is a damage gain over using the Fire 3 proc in Astral Fire 3, and then proceeding to use a weak Fire 3 when entering your next fire phase. In cases where you have a Fire 3 proc already ready to spend, and you also have Manafont ready to use, doing this sequence is not very practical as your Manafont will be sitting there for around 30 seconds waiting to be used. One option is simply to use the Fire 3 proc you get from your previous Paradox, like this. Cast Despair, Flare Start, then use your Firestarter proc to weave Manafont, and then proceed as normal. Or something like this, where you use the Fire 3 proc after casting Manafont. In both of these situations, you're using the Fire 3 proc you get from the Paradox in Astral Fire 3. This could be before Manafont to weave it, or sometime after Manafont, but before the next Paradox, making sure not to overwrite the Fire 3 proc. There's also higher value uses for Fire 3 proc, which we'll cover right now. Have you ever noticed that a lot of top Black Mage players are casting a lot of Transpose during their gameplay? Non-standard gameplay when it comes to Black Mage generally refers to the usage of Transpose in combat to avoid casting your weakest spells. Excluding Scathe, the weakest spells Black Mage has are Fire 3 and Blizzard 3 when casted in the opposite stance. With the 0.7x damage penalty, these are 196 potency each. In Endwalker, much of non-standard focused on holding fire procs and using the passive MP regeneration in Umbral Ice to get mana before transposing back to fire and using your fire proc and finishing a short fire phase with Fire 4s in Despair. As the MP regeneration system has changed in Dawntrail, and especially with the advent of Instant Despair at level 100, non-standard has shifted into using the following ideas. Number 1, Despair is a resource-free instant cast and also does not consume Umbral Hearts gained by Blizzard 4. Number 2, smuggling Paradox from Umbralice to Astral Fire, and then using the Paradox to generate a Firestarter proc to either save for later or use immediately. Number 3, usage of Lucid Dreaming to enhance the weak MP regeneration in Dawntrail to generate the 800 MP minimum requirement to cast Despair without casting an ice spell. And number 4, using Umbral Hearts to cast short 3 Fire 4 or 4 Fire 4 Despair lines with little mana requirement. First, to introduce some terminology, we will generally use the word line to define a sequence of spells that begins with your entry into Umbralice and concludes with the end of your fire phase. So, lines will normally begin with Transpose and end with Despair or Flare Star. Lines can be classified into ones that will generate a Firestarter proc, or lines that spend a Firestarter proc. Let's first start by covering a line that will spend a Firestarter proc, pictured below. In this line, you'll transpose to Umbralice and then use Lucid Dreaming. Then, use the free Umbralice Paradox you receive from transposing and use a filler cast, like High Thunder or Xenoglossy, before transposing to Astral Fire 1, using the Firestarter proc to take you to Astral Fire 3, and then finish with Despair. You must use Lucid Dreaming in this case, which will give you 550 MP when it ticks, and you will also need 2 natural MP regeneration ticks, which give you 200 MP each. You may require additional filler casts like an extra Xenoglossy if you're trying to do this under Leylines, or if you're on a higher spell speed set. This usage of the Firestarter proc is far better than using it in Astral Fire 3 in a standard line, but it is not as strong as using it for an AF1 F3P Standard Line that we covered earlier in the video. You might want to do this line instead in situations where your Manafont is coming off cooldown soon but you have to use your Firestarter proc. Compared with using the Firestarter proc in Astral Fire 3, this would provide an alternative use that generates a free Umbralice Paradox usage before using Manafont. We can also look at Firestarter proc generating lines which utilize Paradox smuggling, pictured here. Let's say that you've just finished the fire phase that we just went over, and you already spent your Firestarter proc. You'll transpose into Umbralice and then cast Blizzard 4. At this point, you have 2500 MP and 3 Umbral Hearts. You also have a Paradox marker since you went from Astral Fire 3 to Umbralice. Then, cast a filler spell like Xeno or High Thunder before transposing back into Astral Fire. You can now cast Paradox in Astral Fire 1, granting a Firestarter proc, and then you can use your remaining mana for Despair, cast in Astral Fire 2. This is known as the Double Transpose Save Paradox line, and it is quite strong as written. You could combine the above Firestarter proc generation line with the AF1 F3P Standard Line for a big gain. But what if you don't have enough time to complete the AF1 F3P Standard Line because a boss will die soon, or because you need to use Manafont? One other alternative would be to chain these lines together to create a Quadruple Transpose line. This line combines the strong Firestarter proc generation line with a spender line. It can be useful because you'll naturally have fire procs around because you'll get one for free every time you cast Paradox just doing a normal standard rotation. One thing you'll notice here that is a benefit of these sequences is that almost every spell is instant cast here except Blizzard 4. Indeed, one benefit of these non-standard lines is that by taking advantage of Paradox and Despair being instant all the time, and having to use filler casts like High Thunder and Xeno, you can use lines like these for high movement scenarios as well, or mechanics with expected movement but at various time points, like Ultimate Relativity in Phase 3 of FRU. Now let's say you were doing the sequence above and your Manafont would come off cooldown right around the time you finished casting the final Despair. Well, in this case you'd actually want to use the Firestarter proc you generated from the Paradox in Astral Fire 2, because after you use Manafont you're going to get another guaranteed Firestarter proc anyways. You shouldn't overwrite Firestarter procs unless you know for sure that you'd gain a stronger GCD somehow by skipping it, which isn't easy to know unless you already have a planned kill time or known phase length. Additionally, since Lucid Dreaming lasts 21 seconds, you definitely want to take advantage of its duration and chain lines together that require its MP regeneration when possible. For example, the below sequence first starts off with the F3P Spender line and transitions into the F3P Generation line before doing the F3P Spender line again. This creates just enough time for you to squeeze out one last lucid dreaming tick in your ice phase. If we add Swiftcast into the mix, there now becomes non-standard spell sequences that are technically loopable. For example, this following spell sequence, which has been going around quite a bit since patch 7.1. In this line, you'll use the F3P generation line that we mentioned before, but you'll use the Firestarter proc before Despair. At this point in time, you'll still have 3 Umbral Hearts. You'll now transpose into Umbral Ice and use Paradox to go to Umbral Ice 2, and then you'll instant cast a Blizzard 3. This Blizzard 3 must be instant casted with Swiftcast or Triplecast, otherwise it will have a 3.5 second cast time. It's also not that bad in terms of potency since it will use the base 280 potency. This Blizzard 3 will give you 5000 MP since it is an ice spell that's casted in Umbral Ice 2. But the real magic happens next, because you are now at Umbral Ice 3 and have 3 Umbral Hearts, which means you've now met the requirements to grant Paradox and Astral Fire. So when you transpose, you'll be an Astral Fire and have Paradox. The Paradox takes up 1600 MP, leaving you with 3400 MP. Each Fire 4 will use 800 MP because of the Umbral Hearts, leaving you with 1000 MP, which is enough to cast Despair. This sequence of spells is quite good and provides an alternative useful tool for planning fights to help you align Manafont better or utilize Swiftcast better in an encounter. But it also forces you to use a Swiftcast or Triplecast charge, and depending on fight timelines, it may not be the best choice at a given time. Combining everything we know, we can create sequences like this. These sequences are powerful tools to put in your back pocket as they generate movement opportunities and are very efficient usages of your resources. The lines individually are short in length, allowing you to pick different ones to suit a situation. For example, aligning Manafont, a specific fight phase length, or a mechanic requiring you to move for a short period of time. One thing you'll notice in these lines is the lack of Flare Star. Naturally, since we aren't getting 6 Astral Souls, we can't use Flare Star in these situations unless we use Manafont, since that will actually give us the requisite resources to do so. Despite the lack of Flare Star, these lines are still advantageous. You might be wondering if you have to play like this to get specific rankings on FF logs. The answer is really no. Like I mentioned in my Endwalker guide, if you already have low DPS, non-standard isn't going to fix that. That's mainly a function of your casting uptime. The most important thing for caster players is to always be casting, and avoid moments where you're moving without casting anything. Non-standard in Dawntrail looks quite a bit different, and in my opinion, a bit more confusing than Endwalker, but it is also quite a bit weaker than its predecessor. It wasn't a necessity then to parse high, and definitely isn't now. I personally find non-standard very interesting to use in Dawntrail, and it's fun to see how other players take advantage of it while meeting the constraints given by an actual encounter, not a striking dummy. Now that we've covered single target Black Mage quite a bit, let's go over AoE. Black Mage has slightly different AoE at 2 targets versus 3 or more targets. First, we'll cover 3+ targets. This would mainly apply for dungeon content. The rotation is pretty much the exact same as Endwalker, but now you only cast 1 High Fire 2 and you have Flare Star added at the end. You can insert High Thunder 2 or Foul anywhere here. However, as you may have noticed, Hive Blizzard 2 and High Fire 2 are not very good. They are 100 potency AoEs and are very underwhelming. You have to factor in that they are the transition spells. They're cast in the opposite element, meaning they actually are 70 potency. Again, very underwhelming. So we can actually also bring non-standard elements into AoE and do something a lot better. Here we transpose into Umbral Ice and then use Freeze. We'll use a filler cast to kill time for transpose to come back off cooldown, and then use 2 flares and then Flare Star. You also are going to be skipping the Ice Paradox here as it's single target, but you will definitely have a filler available as you get a free Thunderhead just by transposing. And yes, the first flare is cast in Astral Fire 1. In any case, this sequence of spells has astronomically better potency per second. In fact, it should really be the only AoE that you use in dungeons. In terms of potency per second at 3 targets, it is roughly 280.92 potency per second versus the standard of 237. This is a staggering 18.5% higher potency per second. You should definitely be incorporating this into your AoE. This is also a gain in earlier levels even before you get Flare Star. Now for 2 target fights. Assuming you can actually stack the bosses together, for example, Phase 4 of Future's Rewritten Ultimate, you will be using a variant of the AoE non-standard. However, you will cast Blizzard 4 instead of Freeze, since Freeze is only better than Blizzard 4 on 3 targets. You can insert High Thunder 2 anywhere here where it needs to be refreshed. It's important to note that you should be using Xenoglossy in 2 target fights. Xenoglossy is 880 potency, and Foul on 2 targets is actually only 840 potency. You can also use Ice Paradox as a filler here, or skip it, but it doesn't make a huge impact. It's just something to consider if you're running low on Xeno, or you have a significant timer on High Thunder 2 left over. If you have Lucid Dreaming running and you get 2 Lucid Dreaming ticks and 2 natural MP ticks, for example burning Xenoglossies as fillers, such that you have 4000 MP, you can actually skip the Ice Paradox and use it in Astral Fire instead. With 2400 MP left over, you'll have enough to cast your 2 flares and then Flare Star. This is even stronger because now your first flare is in Astral Fire 2 instead of Astral Fire 1. Lastly, I wanted to cover some helpful tips and tricks you should know when playing Black Mage. The first one is about weaving. I covered it before in my Endwalker guide, but it's worth going over again. Weaving refers to using off-global cooldown abilities like Amplifier, Triplecast, Swiftcast, Mana Ward, Manafont, Surecast, or even items like Intelligence Potions after using an instant casted spell. Now, why is it important that we weave our abilities? This is because when you use one of these off-global cooldown abilities, there is an associated animation lock which prevents your character from casting any spells. If you try and use an off-global cooldown ability right after a hard-casted spell, you'll notice you cannot cast your next spell until the animation lock is finished. This delay is called clipping, and you should avoid it as much as possible. Each instance of clipping is around 0.7 seconds of effectively lost time, which can add up a lot in a fight. You should always use your off-global cooldown abilities after an instant casted spell, such as Xenoglossy, Fire 3 Proc, High Thunder, Paradox, Despair, or any spell that's made instant with Triplecast or Swiftcast. You can also weave after a fast cast, that is, when you cast a Blizzard 3 from Astral Fire 3, or a Fire 3 from Umbralize 3. These casts are very short and leave room to weave one single off-global cooldown ability. You can normally weave 2 off-global cooldown abilities after an instant cast, but if you are under Leylines, you might clip a little bit, especially at higher spell speeds or higher ping. If you try and weave 3 abilities, you will clip a little bit. The second is a helpful macro that you can use if you are a mouse and keyboard player. This one is an Ethereal Manipulation mouseover macro. You'll want to make sure you use the M-error part of the macro, otherwise if you pressed it without mousing over a valid target, your chat box would be spammed with error messages. Ethereal Manipulation is very handy, especially if you have teammates who tend to be in the right spot at the right time. The mouseover macro is preferred to using it as is, since you won't have to detarget the boss, target an ally, press manip, and then retarget the boss. You could also technically replace the mouseover part of the macro with the number of the ally from your party list, but this is less preferred since you might not want to select the same person every time. The third is on recognizing when a fight is going to require you to move. Each fight will have these mandatory movement points where you are absolutely required to move to resolve a mechanic. Let's go over a specific example. Here is the first minute and a half of M3S timeline that I found online. By the way, looking at timelines like these are very useful in terms of fight planning and getting more familiar with what mechanics are coming next. The first movement point you can see is at 38 seconds, where you need to be in a specific position for the Quadruple or Octuple Lariat. As this is during your opener, this one is fairly trivial to resolve, since you can use your various instant casts to pre-position in your clock spot. Then we see a Quadro or Octoboom dive at 49 seconds. This means that we need to have an instant cast prepared sometime in this time frame in order to move to the safe spot. or use Aetherial Manipulation to an ally in the safe spot. This could be a use case for the free Xenoglossy you got 30 seconds into the fight, an Umbralized Paradox, a Firestarter proc, etc. But then take a look at the timeline. The next mechanic where you actually have to be in a specific location is at 1 minute and 28 seconds for the Towers mechanic. If you've done M3S before, you know that this mechanic knocks you around the map for a few seconds. It's definitely a mechanic you'd want more than one instant cast for. This is where Triplecast will be handy. It just so happens that you will have a Triplecast charge here if you used both of them in your opener. So this is a perfect spot to use a Triplecast charge for. That being said, it is definitely resolvable without Triplecast, and depending on what your fight plan is, that could be the preferred option. For example, a High Thunder into Paradox into Swiftcast Fire 4 and a Xenoglossy would also work to cover the mechanic. But then consider that you've used up a Xenoglossy that you might want to hold for something later, like the 2-minute raid buff window. Or maybe the Paradox would make you have to use your Firestarter proc in a suboptimal way to maintain Enochian. Thinking about fights like this, in my opinion, will really improve your gameplay as you begin to see 10 to 15 seconds ahead into a fight and preserve resources for when they are truly necessary. The fourth and final tip is playing into raid buffs. While Black Mage does not have a raid buff of its own, one of the best things that you can do for your team to maximize the overall damage you contribute is to use the right abilities within raid buffs. Within the standard 20-second raid buff window, and assuming you're playing on a slower critical hit set, you will be able to get a maximum of 10 spells inside 20-second raid buffs. In order to do this, you must be in Leylines, and you also need to hardcast your first spell into raid buffs. This is why we have that one hardcast 5/4 in the opener. In this game, when you instant cast a spell, any buffs on your character, or debuffs on the enemy, snapshot as soon as you press the button. But when you hardcast the spell, any buffs on your character or debuffs on the enemy snapshot at the point that you reach the slidecast window. This is approximately 0.5 seconds before your cast finishes. So if you cast a Fire 4 and then you receive Divination from an Astrologian when there's 1 second left on your Fire 4 cast, then you successfully hardcasted your Fire 4 into raid buffs. You want this to occur so that you can have the vast majority of that Fire 4 cast time outside of raid buffs, giving you more time to actually place spells within buffs. To that end, you also want to make sure that your last cast in raid buffs is an instant cast. If you can press a Xenoglossy when Divination has 0.5 seconds left on it, you are effectively getting as much out of that raid buff as possible, since a hard-casted spell would not be able to make use of that buff. You should aim to have high potency spells in raid buff windows, so these include Paradox, Fire 4, Despair, Flare Star, High Thunder, and Xenoglossy. For example, a buff window with 10 spells could include 3 Fire 4s, then Despair, High Thunder, Flare Star, and then 4 Xenoglossies, with the first Fire 4 being hardcast into the buff window. Of course, this is all under Leylines. You should avoid casting weak spells like Blizzard 3 or Fire 3 under buff windows if possible. Obviously, this is an optimistic scenario, and it may not be prudent to dump every single Xenoglossy you have into raid buffs for a given moment. Although Xenoglossy in raid buffs is really powerful, if you lose uptime somewhere else because you run out of movement tools, the gain is erased. Let's compare two different raid buff windows as an example. In terms of party buffs, let's assume you have an Astrologian's Divination, which is 6%, a Dancer's Technical Finish, which is 5%, a Ninja's Dokumori, which is 5%, and a Monk's Brotherhood, which is 5%. Buffs in this game are multiplicative, so this would end up being a total party buff of approximately 23%. If you were to trade one Xenoglossy in your raid buff window for a Fire 4, the total net potency loss to the raid is only 70 potency. All this to say that you can totally play into raid buffs, but it's definitely not the end of the world if your raid buff window is not completely riddled with Xenoglossies. If casting that extra Xeno gains you 70 potency due to buffs, but then you lose casting uptime elsewhere because you no longer have that Xeno, you've completely eliminated the gain from the raid buff. But if you can afford to do it losslessly, you will be adding additional value to the raid. Well, that wraps up my Dawntrail Black Mage guide. I hope this video has helped you better understand and improve your Black Mage gameplay, whether you're just starting out or looking to optimize. If you found this guide helpful, please like the video and subscribe for more FF14 content. If you have any questions or you want to share your own tips, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Remember, mastery takes practice, so keep casting, stay in your ley lines, and most importantly, have fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.